Okay, this is a review of basic watercolor painting techniques, and I hope this is helpful. So to begin with, always make sure that your color is pre-mixed and ready on your palette so that you're not wetting your paper and then having to mix your color and then come back and wet your paper again. So when it comes to applying water to your paper, make sure your brush is clean, make sure that the water is really clean, and as you're laying the water onto the paper, make sure that you haven't put too much water so that there's a puddle, but that the actual surface is glistening. Next, I dip my clean brush into water. I fill it with the pigment. I'm always testing to make sure that I don't have too much water in my brush so that when I do lay it down on the paper, I get a really good even stream of color working from side to side. Okay? It's at this point that by using a clean, damp brush, I can lift color away, say for instance for a highlighted area. And this, it works really well for a highlighted area that has soft edges. I use tissue, Kleenex tissue, because it's super absorbent and it's really soft on the paper. Okay. So building a continuous tone with watercolor. So I am applying that water on the paper. Sometimes you need to make a second pass as you want that paper to, the water to really glisten on the surface. Even that takes a little bit of practice. So I am going to load my brush with clean water, tap it a couple of times, test the paint color in the bristles, and I'm really only loading the top half of my brush. And then as I move down in the wetted area, I'm laying my brush flatter towards the belly. I will then go and empty some of the pigment from the brush by dipping it in water so that I have a nice, smooth, continuous tone working from the top color downward. You can also do the same, working from the bottom of the paper upward. So I'm putting water on the paper, and as you may be able to see, it's pretty wet. I'm going to give it a minute to absorb into the paper, go back over it a little bit, just to maintain that glistening state. And then I'm going to load my brush with clean water in the belly, test out the point where the color is sitting, and again brush back and forth. I find it's easier to work from the top downward, but it's good to know how to be able to pull the color upward depending on where you're at in your artwork. So filling your brush with a little fresh water and pulling out of that green and moving towards the top. Now you can work with two colors in an area. And I'm adding some clean water. And you can let them mix themselves together as they move towards each other. So I'll start with really nice bright orange red. And I'm just going to pull that color downwards. And then I'm going to move into using a green. So working wet on wet, here's my green, and I am pulling that green now up into the orange red. So what I'm going to end up with is a mix of both colors. They're just going to automatically mix themselves together and give you that shade color you're looking for, a shadow color. Or, this is dry enough now, you can add that second color on top of your first wash. Once the paper is dry, take and lightly brush a coat of clean water on top. Lift the pigment off of your palette and then lay it on top of the area that you just dampened. So we're working wet on wet. So what we end up with is really nice clean color, whereas on this other side we ended up lifting some of the red orange and ended up with a shade color. If I were to go back, it's still slightly damp, and add more color on top, you can see a very big difference between waiting for the paper to dry and applying the second color, or working wet on wet so that the colors mix right on the paper. It depends on what part of the painting that you're working on. Okay. Then there is color charging. So I'm going to work wet on dry paper and apply my paint. This takes practice as well, because what you're doing is coming over top that first color and just keep on blending, pulling the color down towards the bottom of the area that you're working in. If you prefer to work wet on wet, wait for the paper to have a glistening effect. Test your brush and then lay your color on. So you'll notice the difference between working wet on dry and wet on wet. This mix of color was identical to this, but working wet on wet, the color diffused itself, so it's much lighter, and it's a much smoother application. Both applications work really, really well depending on the area that you're working inside of your color. Working wet on dry dries quicker than working wet on wet. So often I will work wet on dry and just really work at managing my edges. So what we're going to do here, since this part is already dry, I'm going to put a layer of clean water on top. Going to make sure that it's glistening. What you don't want to do is start scrubbing that layer, because what is going to happen is the paint is going to lift from your very first layer. Charging is just dropping color in or drawing color in on a surface and letting it feather into the water that the paint is on top of. Let's see, we can get some more color here. You can add color around or inside of the color that you just dropped and tapped on the page, and you'll end up with colors mixing together, which is really great for painting fall leaves, a variety of different forms of patterning. You just have to know how your colors are going to end up mixing together. If you're going to end up with a muddy shadow color, or if you're going to remain painting really bright colors onto the paper. You'll see where the quinacridone went over the blue. It's now a violet, a really light violet. So understanding what you want to do when you're charging color on paper, what you're hoping for, but then leaving the color and not working with it. Once the edges have dried a little bit, you can use the point of your brush and just start teasing with clean water, teasing those edges outward into the color around it. So you end up with really nice soft edges. Okay, we're going to do the same here. I'm going to apply my water, not scrubbing, just laying a coat of water to dampen the surface. And let's go into violets. Again, have your colors pre-mixed. You can stipple with the point. You can pull the paint as well. But the important thing is to just let the paint relax on the dampened surface. If you have hard edges, it means that the paper wasn't dampened quite enough. So I'm just going to add a little water on the outside of those surfaces. To soften them up a little bit. So this will come in really handy for bee tracks, for color changes on petals, inside of leaves. There's a lot you can do working either wet on wet or wet on dry, and knowing your color combinations so that when you're mixing them, you end up with the color that you actually intended. From this bright quinacridone to ending up with a red-orange, mixing with the green, or with a nice blend of both colors in the middle. So lifting works extremely well. Working wet on wet, I like to do that with highlights. I also like to use an eradicator brush if I want to lift out color. So I haven't put any water here. My brush is damp dry, and I can just pull it through the color. Either direction works. So that you can lift out really light details or erase away information that, and I say erase, it's really lifting away, not so much erasing, so that you can correct or make really refined details on your work. Okay, so I hope this helps, and I'll go on to the next video.